Tonight, we open a door the Vatican hoped would stay shut forever. A story written not in ink, but in stone, in calendars carved by hands that counted beyond time itself. The Mayan Prophecies did not whisper of apocalypse. They spoke of cycles, renewals, and thresholds that terrified those who built their power on a single ending. For centuries, conquistadors carried crosses into jungles of star temples and stone cities. They burned the books, silenced the sky priests, and hid the codices that survived. But some fragments slipped through. Tables of Venus, more precise than Europe's, glyphs of eclipses that matched the heavens with terrifying accuracy, writings that hinted not at doom but at a universe that never ends, only begins again. The Vatican's greatest fear was not heresy. It was that people might see time as a wheel, not a line. Because a wheel gives you infinite chances. A line leaves you only one, with the keys held by men in robes. And if the wheel was true, the Church's greatest weapon, fear of final judgment, would vanish. So before you dismiss this as just another legend, ask yourself, what if the Mayans were not predicting the end of the world, but the end of control? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we step into the prophecies the Vatican could not burn, and once you see them, you cannot forget. A calendar that does not end, a clock that does not strike midnight. Imagine a system of time so vast, so precise, that it dared to measure not just centuries, but ages of the world itself. The Maya did not fear endings. They studied cycles. They carved them into stone, traced them across the stars, and carried them in stories that stretched back further than memory. And this was the first reason the Vatican trembled, because while Christianity demanded one creation and one final judgment, the Mayan long count spoke of endless renewal, of beginnings that followed endings as naturally as sunrise follows night. When Spanish ships touched the shores of the Yucatán in the early 16th century, they did not find a people waiting for salvation. They found a civilization already measuring the heavens with a mathematics so sharp it could predict eclipses hundreds of years in advance. Priests carried crosses, but the Maya carried time itself. They had been tracking the cycles of Venus long before Galileo tilted a telescope toward the sky. They knew that the sun, the moon, and the planets did not move in straight lines, leading to a single finale. They danced in patterns that returned again and again. This way of seeing the universe was dangerous to a church that thrived on a one-way road. The Vatican told the faithful that time began with creation, that sin entered the world with Adam, and that at some point in the future, a trumpet would sound, the heavens would open, and the story would end forever. That story gave the church absolute power. It meant only through them could a soul prepare for the last day. But the Mayan calendar whispered another truth. There is no last day. There is only transformation. The long count begins far in the past, in a date written not as year 1, but as 13, 0000 in Mayan notation. To the Maya, this was not myth, it was mathematics. It placed human history inside a cosmic rhythm where worlds rise, collapse, and rise again. To European priests trained in the scriptures, such an idea was not only alien, it was heretical. If worlds could end and begin without divine judgment, then the church no longer held the keys to eternity. Think of what it meant for a villager in Spain in the year 1500. He was taught that history was a straight line, beginning with Genesis and ending with Revelation. To question that was to risk the Inquisition. Yet on the other side of the ocean stood temples etched with dates older than the flood, older than Moses, older even than the creation of the world, as told in the Bible. The Maya had measured ages of thousands of years, not just the brief span of human memory. The long count did not promise an apocalypse. It promised renewal. Every Bacton, a cycle of nearly 400 years, was another chapter in the breathing of the cosmos. The Maya did not fear the end of the calendar, because to them, an end was simply the doorway to a new beginning. But to the Vatican, This was blasphemy, because if people believed time was infinite and self-renewing, they might stop fearing the final judgment. And without fear, power begins to crumble. That is why the Mayan long count was not just a calendar. It was a threat, a clock that told humanity they were part of an eternal cycle, not captives waiting for an ending decreed by one authority. A truth written in stone and stars, one that even fire could not erase. The jungle was alive with whispers. Trees rose like walls of a cathedral, and the air carried the sound of insects, birds, and unseen movements in the shadows. Into this world marched men in steel, their banners heavy with the sign of the cross. They believed they carried the light of Rome into a wilderness of idols and superstition, yet the deeper they pressed into the Yucatán, the more it seemed they had stepped into a civilization older, stranger, and far more advanced than anything their sermons had prepared them for. The conquistadors expected savages. Instead, they found stone cities laid out with mathematical precision, pyramids aligned to solstices, and temples built to mirror constellations. In these cities, every wall and every carving seemed to speak the language of the heavens. It was not chaos, it was order of a kind they could not easily dismiss. And when they asked the Maya who had built these places, the answer was even more unsettling. We did. And before us, others, who understood the same cycles of time, letters sent back to Spain began to tremble with unease. Soldiers wrote of calendars etched into stone that stretched back thousands of years before the birth of Christ. Priests described rituals tied not to a final judgment, but to the return of ages again and again. It was said that some temples even predicted the very year strangers would arrive from across the sea, carrying strange weapons and diseases. For men raised on the authority of Genesis, where the world was made in 6 days and destined for one final day, such a claim was nothing short of a direct challenge to Scripture. The jungle was not simply foreign, it was a mirror turned back upon Europe. For here was a people who had mapped the planets with greater accuracy than Ptolemy, who carved eclipse records into stone centuries before the Vatican even admitted such knowledge belonged to man. Here was a culture that measured ages in cycles, lasting longer than the lifespan of empires. And when the conquistadors stood beneath the towering steps of temples reaching to the sky, they felt a fear their swords could not cut down. To hide that fear, they called it heresy. They spoke of idols, demons, and heathen lies. But privately, in letters sealed with wax and carried across the ocean, they admitted something Rome could never allow. These calendars, these prophecies, seemed older than the very story of Genesis. They told of times before creation, of worlds lost and reborn. If such records were true, then the Church's claim to hold the only path to salvation would crumble. And so, the jungle became not just a battlefield of armies, but a battlefield of memory. Crosses were planted in the soil, but beneath them lay stones carved with stories of the cosmos, stories that did not bow to Rome. Every temple the Spaniards toppled was not just a victory of steel over stone, but an attempt to bury a timeline that contradicted their own. When Rome met the jungle, it was not the clash of primitive and civilized. It was the meeting of two visions of time, one straight and narrow, the other vast and unending. And in that meeting, the Church saw a danger far greater than armies. It saw a truth that could not be controlled. In the clearings of the jungle stood monuments that defied time. Tall stone stelae, carved with glyphs so intricate they seemed alive, whispered of events not only in the present, but of ages long past. They recorded dynasties, battles, and celestial cycles, but what disturbed the missionaries most were the prophecies. These stones spoke of worlds before our world, of creations and destructions that had come and gone in endless rhythm. To the Maya, the stelae were not myths, but markers of truth, etched into rock so that memory could never be erased by fire or flood. When the Spaniards first gazed upon them, they sent frantic reports across the Atlantic. The letters carried descriptions of towering stones covered with symbols, calendars that tracked time not in years, but in cycles lasting thousands of years. Some of these reports never reached the wider public. They were copied, stored, and sealed within scriptoria, where only chosen eyes would ever see them. Because among the stories recorded on those stones were visions of ages before the biblical creation, ages that stretched back into time, so ancient it seemed to erase the boundaries of Genesis itself. Priests charged with converting the Maya faced a dilemma. If they acknowledged the depth of these inscriptions, they risked undermining the very core of Christian teaching. If they denied them, they had to explain how an entire civilization had created such precise records of the heavens and the earth. The solution was silence. The most troubling passages, those that told of repeated cycles of humanity rising and falling, those that hinted at cosmic events shaping destinies, were carefully left out of sermons and reports. The Church's narrative of one creation and one end could not withstand comparison with a calendar that saw many beginnings and many endings. The stelae told of alignments of planets, of the return of Venus as a morning star, of eclipses that could be calculated centuries in advance. When these records were checked against the sky, they proved astonishingly accurate. The conquistadors might have crushed cities and burned codices, but the stones were not so easily destroyed. They stood as undeniable evidence of a science that rivaled or surpassed anything Europe possessed at the time. The Vatican, upon learning this, could not allow the knowledge to spread freely, and so Europe heard only fragments. Scholars read carefully edited dispatches, where the stones were described as idols of superstition, not instruments of knowledge. The vast historical scope of the inscriptions, stretching beyond the biblical timeline, was conveniently omitted. What survived was a shadow of the truth, a version of events tailored to keep order intact. In silence, the Church buried the voices of the stones. But silence is not the same as absence. The stelae still stand in the jungles, weathered but unbroken, their glyphs speaking across centuries. They carry a story of humanity not as a straight line but as a wheel, turning endlessly. And it was that wheel, carved into stone and ignored in Rome, that threatened to unseat the authority of those who claim to control time itself. There are moments when the sky itself becomes a clock, when the sun vanishes in the middle of the day and the world is plunged into a sudden night. Even the most powerful empires fall silent. The Maya knew these moments well. On their stelae and codices they recorded eclipses with a precision that baffles scholars to this day. They carved glyphs, predicting when the sun would darken, when the moon would cover its face, and when light would return. When modern astronomers checked those records, the alignments matched perfectly. It was as if the Maya had reached through time itself to tell us they understood the heavens better than anyone expected. For a civilization dismissed as primitive idol worshippers, this accuracy was unsettling. How could they have known? European science of the 15th and 16th centuries struggled to predict eclipses with certainty. Yet the Maya had been recording them for centuries, even millennia. They did not rely on guesswork or miracles. They relied on numbers, cycles, and long, careful observation. Their sky mathematics did not speak of chaos, but of rhythm, of patterns that repeated again and again. And this was dangerous knowledge to a church that claimed the heavens as proof of divine will alone. Imagine the shock of missionaries when they realized that the Maya had written down eclipses that occurred hundreds of years before Christ was born, and even projected those that would occur long after. To the Vatican, the sky was supposed to reveal the order of God, not the calculations of men. An eclipse was a miracle, a sign of judgment, or a message from heaven. But to the Maya it was simply the universe keeping time, a pattern that could be understood and even predicted. Reports of these glyphs reached Europe, but many were buried in silence. If the Maya could predict the most terrifying celestial events with accuracy, then their other prophecies could not be dismissed so easily. What if their stories of world ages, of cycles of creation and destruction, were just as precise as their eclipse tables? What if their warnings of renewal were not superstition, but knowledge. The possibility was too dangerous to admit. The phrase, "the day the sun stood still," became more than a poetic line. It became a symbol of fear. Because on those days when the sky went dark and then returned to light exactly as the glyphs foretold, even the most skeptical Spaniard had to admit the Maya knew something profound. It meant that the heavens could be read without the Bible. It meant the order of the cosmos was accessible to anyone patient enough to watch and record. It meant the church was not the only keeper of truth. And so the glyphs were hidden, the codices burned, the knowledge reduced to whispers in forbidden texts. But the sky does not forget. Eclipses still arrive exactly on schedule, just as the Maya said they would. And each time the shadow of the moon glides across the earth, it carries a reminder of the civilization that measured the heavens so well that even today their accuracy humbles us. What else might they have gotten right if only their voice had not been silenced? The story of time is not just about clocks or calendars. It is about who controls the meaning of existence. In Europe, the church taught that history was a line. It began with creation. It was scarred by sin, and it would one day end in a final judgment where every soul was weighed for eternity. That vision gave priests enormous power. They alone could prepare people for the last day. They alone held the keys to salvation. Fear of that coming end kept whole nations obedient. But in the jungles of Central America, a very different vision of time was carved into stone and painted onto bark paper. The Maya did not fear a single ending. They believed in cycles. Ages rose and fell like the Sunday. A world might collapse, but another would be born. Renewal followed destruction, just as spring follows winter. Instead of one final apocalypse, there were countless renewals, endless chances for humanity to begin again. This belief stripped fear of its teeth. Because if endings are always followed by beginnings, then no single institution can claim to guard the only doorway to eternity. This clash between linear apocalypse and cyclical renewal was not just philosophy, it was a battle for authority. In the Christian world, the threat of eternal damnation was a weapon sharper than any sword. The faithful obeyed because they feared being cast out forever. The Mayan worldview taught that even the collapse of an age was part of the larger rhythm of the cosmos. There was no eternal exile, only transformation. To the Vatican, this idea was unacceptable. It robbed them of the very tool that kept people dependent on their blessing. Imagine a farmer in Spain around the year 1500. He lived under the shadow of sermons, warning of the end times. He believed that one mistake could condemn him forever. Now, imagine if he learned of a people across the ocean who believed that destruction was never final, that renewal was woven into the fabric of the universe. Which vision would he choose to believe? Which vision gave him more hope, more freedom, more reason to question the authority of those who demanded obedience through fear? The Mayan cycles also offered something the church could not. They gave people a way to understand disaster without despair. A drought, a war, even the collapse of a city could be seen as part of a larger turning of the wheel. The church demanded submission in the face of suffering. The Maya accepted suffering as a chapter, not the end of the story. This difference shook the very foundation of the European worldview, and so the two theologies collided. One proclaimed a single road leading to an eternal courtroom. The other described a circle that always brought you back to the beginning. One depended on fear of judgment. The other rested on trust in renewal. And in that difference lay the greatest threat of all. Because if people believed time was a circle instead of a line, the gatekeepers of sin would lose their grip. They would no longer control the ending, and without control of the ending, they would no longer control the story. The night sky glowed red, not from the stars above, but from the fires below. Pyramids that once stood as observatories now looked down upon great piles of books set ablaze. These were not books of parchment and leather like in Europe. They were made of bark paper coated with lime, folded like long screens, painted with glyphs of gods, rulers, and most of all time itself. To the Maya, these codices were living memory, a library that stretched back across centuries. To the missionaries who arrived with the sword in one hand and the cross in the other, they were idols, dangerous containers of forbidden truth. Friars marched into cities and ordered the codices gathered. Some were offered willingly by those who feared punishment. Others were ripped from temples and homes. When the bonfires roared to life, the priests prayed loudly, as if purifying the land. They told the people that the flames freed them from lies. Yet, in reality, the fires were silencing voices that had recorded the heavens more carefully than any European scholar of that time. With each crackle of burning bark, cycles of eclipses, calendars of Venus, and histories of kings vanished into smoke. The most infamous of these acts came in the year 1562, when Bishop Diego de Landa oversaw the destruction of countless codices in Mani. He wrote proudly of his work, declaring that all the books contained nothing but superstition and falsehoods. But centuries later, his words read like a confession of cultural murder, because from hundreds, maybe thousands of Mayan books, only 4 are known to survive. 4 fragile survivors of a forest of memory turned to ash. Why such fury against pieces of painted bark? Because within those pages lay a view of the cosmos that threatened the story Rome told the world. The codices did not describe one creation. They described many. They did not foretell one final end. They spoke of renewal. They calculated eclipses and tracked planets with a precision Europe could not match. If such knowledge became widely known, it would undermine the claim that only the Church could unlock the mysteries of heaven and earth. So fire became the simplest solution. What people could no longer read, they could no longer question. Yet the destruction was never total. Some Maya hid codices in caves, others memorized the stories and carried them in secret whispers across generations. Even the friar, Diego de Landa, perhaps haunted by what he had destroyed, preserved fragments in his own writings, notes that later scholars would use to unlock the meaning of the surviving texts. The irony is cruel. Those who set the fires also left behind the clues that would one day betray what was lost. The burning of the libraries of the forest was not just an attack on a culture, it was an attempt to erase an entire way of understanding reality. The smoke that rose into the night carried with it centuries of knowledge that no sword could have defeated, and though the flames died, their absence still lingers. Because the easiest truth to control is the one reduced to ash, leaving behind only silence where once there had been stars, numbers, and voices carved in ink. In the ashes of the great burnings, when thousands of Mayan books had been fed to the fire, a small handful escaped. 4 codices, fragile as the bark paper they were written on, survived the fury of missionaries and conquistadors. They were not spared by chance. They were spared because a few priests understood that even in their mission to erase, they were also facing something too extraordinary to fully destroy. These books, painted with glyphs of gods, stars, and sacred cycles, were taken not as treasures to share, but as trophies to lock away. Each codex told stories far beyond the myths Europe expected. One recorded detailed eclipse cycles and planetary movements, matching modern astronomical calculations almost without flaw. Another described rituals tied to the turning of the Bactons, cycles of nearly 400 years that guided entire civilizations. They were not books of fairy tales, they were manuals of time itself. And this was precisely why they were not allowed to circulate freely. Knowledge of this kind could not be dismissed as superstition. It had to be hidden, catalogued, and kept under the shadow of doctrine. The 4 survivors now bear the names of the places they eventually surfaced. The Dresden Codex in Germany, the Madrid Codex in Spain, the Paris Codex in France, and the Grolier Codex, found much later in Mexico. Each travelled across oceans, passed through the hands of collectors, kings, and scholars who often did not realize the weight of what they held. By the time Europe began to study them in earnest, entire centuries had passed. But the Vatican had already known of their existence long before. Reports mention how copies or fragments were reviewed quietly by clergy, their details compared, their most threatening parts noted, and then silenced. Imagine what it meant for a 16th century priest to open a Mayan codex and see the cycle of Venus mapped for centuries into the past and future. Imagine realizing these calculations matched events in the sky more accurately than the tables available in Rome. To admit this would be to admit that the so-called heathens had mastered the heavens without the church, without the Bible, without the authority of God as Europe defined it. And so, the books were treated like dangerous artifacts. They were kept safe, but safely out of reach. To this day, scholars marvel at their detail. They are filled with gods painted in vivid colours, but behind the symbols lies raw mathematics and astronomy. They reveal that the Maya saw the universe not as chaos, but as a grand pattern in which humanity was woven. And perhaps most striking of all, they hint that history itself was recorded as repeating cycles, something Europe could not allow to compete with the single path from creation to judgment. The last 4 books survived the fire, but survival came at a cost. They were no longer living documents of a people. They became caged knowledge, trapped in foreign libraries and ecclesiastical vaults. Preserved not to enlighten, but to contain. 4 voices among thousands silenced, kept alive only so they could be controlled. And in their silence lies the memory of all the others lost to the flames. When the Spanish ships first touched the shores of the Yucatán in the early 16th century, many accounts tell us that the Maya and Aztec peoples already expected their arrival. Some stories claim that the timing fell neatly within a prophecy, a cycle marked on their calendars long before sails were spotted on the horizon. For some, this became proof that the Mayan calendar had foretold not just the motions of planets, but the destiny of entire nations. The question that haunted the Vatican was simple. Was this destiny truly written in stone, or was it a tale polished by hindsight to fit the conqueror's story? The Aztecs believed in the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, said to one day arrive from the east during a specific year of the calendar. When Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico in the year 1519, many chroniclers later suggested it matched this exact cycle. Some claim Montezuma hesitated to resist Cortés because he feared he might be the prophesied return. For the Church, this detail was deeply useful. It made conquest look inevitable, even blessed by prophecy. But behind the usefulness lies a troubling possibility. Were these stories preserved faithfully or shaped later by those who wanted history to serve them? The Mayan long count itself spoke not of individuals, but of cycles. Each backtune brought shifts in power, transformations of the world. In their worldview, the arrival of foreigners could easily be absorbed into that rhythm. Outsiders appearing from the sea would not have been impossible to expect. After all, the Maya were keen observers of cycles, not only of the heavens, but of human destiny. Just as the sun returns, so too does upheaval. Whether Spaniards fit neatly into that framework, or whether the framework was bent to accommodate them, is the mystery. Letters from friars and conquistadors back to Spain often highlight these so-called prophecies. They paint a picture of a people almost resigned to defeat, waiting for a cycle to fulfill itself. But when you read closely, contradictions appear. Some native accounts describe fierce resistance, skepticism, and anger. Others speak of cautious respect but not surrender. This raises the question of how much of the prophecy narrative was shaped by the conquerors to justify their conquest. If the natives were destined to lose, then Rome's victory looked like fate, not force. For the Vatican, this narrative was powerful. It meant that even in the jungles, even in the temples of another world, time itself had been preparing for the arrival of the cross. It turned conquest into divine fulfillment. Yet the same idea terrified them too. If prophecy could be this accurate, if a calendar could truly anticipate events centuries in advance, what else might it have foreseen? What other truths were locked within its cycles that Europe was never meant to hear. Perhaps the calendar did not predict strangers from the East. Perhaps it simply reminded its people that all things return, that every empire meets its moment of change. But the silence that followed, the burning of codices, and the rewriting of stories ensured that we may never know if it was prophecy or hindsight. What remains is the unsettling thought that the Maya may have seen the Spaniards coming long before the sails cut the horizon, and that truth was far too dangerous for the Vatican to leave in the open. High above the jungle canopy, the Maya built temples that were not only places of worship, but also observatories. At the top of those stone towers stood the sky priests, men trained from childhood to read the movements of the heavens. They watched the sun rise and set, they tracked the phases of the moon, but above all, they followed Venus. This brilliant planet was not just a wandering star to them. It was a cosmic marker, a clock hand moving across the sky that announced war, peace, harvest, and ritual. With patient eyes and endless calculations, the sky priests created Venus tables so precise that modern astronomers still marvel at their accuracy. These tables, carved into codices, predicted the planet's path for centuries into the future. They noted when Venus would appear as the morning star, when it would vanish into the sun's glare, and when it would return as the evening star. The errors in these calculations were so small, they would not be matched in Europe until centuries later. For the Maya, these were not curiosities. They were sacred tools, guiding kings in the timing of battles and farmers in the timing of crops. The heavens were the rhythm of life, and the sky priests were its interpreters. When Spaniards captured these codices, they were astonished. Some saw them as dangerous pagan texts and tossed them into fires, but others recognized their value. Copies of the Venus tables quietly traveled across the ocean, studied in secret by scholars who realized they were holding something extraordinary. They compared them with European tables and found the Mayan calculations often superior. This knowledge, if made public, would raise troubling questions. How could a so-called heathen people outmatch the astronomical skill of Christendom? How could they measure the heavens without the Bible, without Europe's centuries of philosophy and scripture? The solution was familiar: silence. The most accurate versions of these tables disappeared into private collections and archives. A few fragments resurfaced in European libraries, but stripped of context and reduced to curiosities. The full truth of the Mayan mastery of Venus was too dangerous to admit. It undermined the narrative that Europe alone carried the light of knowledge. It suggested that wisdom could be found in the jungles, carved into stone and painted onto bark, long before Galileo raised his telescope in the year 1609. For the Vatican, this was especially threatening. In Christian tradition, Venus was often tied to symbols of temptation, even the figure of Lucifer, the light bringer. To acknowledge that the Maya had tamed this star with mathematics was to admit that truth could be found outside the church, in a place they had declared a land of darkness. The Venus tables revealed that heaven's clock was not owned by Rome. It could be read by anyone willing to watch the sky with devotion and patience. The sky priests are gone, their temples weathered by centuries of rain, yet their knowledge remains etched in the surviving codices. That knowledge travelled across the ocean, but its sharpest edge was dulled, hidden away where few could see. Somewhere in those sealed vaults lie the most accurate tables of Venus, reminders that long before Europe claimed mastery of the heavens, the Maya had already mapped the stars with almost surgical precision. And that truth was too much for the gatekeepers of time to leave in the light. The Maya measured time in breaths far larger than years or centuries. They counted in baktuns, cycles of nearly 400 years that stacked upon one another, like chapters in a book too vast for any one lifetime to read. In their worldview, history was not a straight path from creation to destruction, but a rhythm, a cosmic pulse, where endings were simply the gateways to beginnings. Every baktun brought transformation. Every baktun ended with renewal. This idea clashed directly with the narrative the Vatican had built for centuries. In Rome, the foundation of authority rested on the idea of a single, unbroken line. From the Apostle Peter, chosen by Christ, through pope after pope, the Church claimed to carry a chain of succession that proved its divine legitimacy. That chain was not a cycle. It was a line that could never be broken. If history moved in circles instead of straight lines, then the claim of unbroken continuity began to falter, because cycles mean that power is not inherited forever. It is renewed, reset, and reshaped. The Maya saw no eternal chain. They saw renewal waiting at the end of every age. This vision was more than philosophy, it was power. The Church's authority came from convincing millions that only one story of time was true. A story where history began once, where sin entered once, and where judgment would arrive once. That final judgment required preparation, and only the gatekeepers in Rome held the keys. But the Mayan Baktun mocked this vision. It said that history itself resets, that civilizations fall and rise again, that no authority lasts beyond the cycle. It meant that even the most powerful throne could be swept away when the wheel turned. Imagine what it felt like for a missionary to stand in front of a temple wall inscribed with dates that stretched back thousands of years, far older than the birth of Christ, and then forward thousands more, long after their own lives. Imagine realizing that this timeline made the chain of popes look like a brief thread in a much larger pattern. To admit this was to admit that Rome's authority might not be eternal. It was only temporary, waiting for the next turning of the cycle. The Maya did not ask, who holds the keys to heaven? They asked when the cycle would shift, when the wheel would turn. Their rituals, their calendars, their prophecies were all built on the expectation of change, and in that expectation lay freedom. No institution could claim absolute control, because every age was destined to end, no matter how powerful its rulers seemed. The Church could not allow this idea to spread. It turned cycles into superstition, Baktuns into heresy, and stone inscriptions into pagan nonsense. But beneath the silence, the question remained. If history truly breathes in cycles, then what becomes of the so-called keys of Peter? Perhaps they are not keys to eternity at all, but keys that open only one chapter in a story that keeps turning. And when the wheel of time turns again, even the strongest chains of succession may prove fragile. In the jungles of Mesoamerica, the Maya carved into stone an idea older than empires and more unsettling than any sword. It was the belief that time itself does not march forward, but circles back upon itself. The eternal return. Every creation would end, and every ending would give birth to a new beginning. For them, truth was not a single moment locked in the past. It was a rhythm, a melody that returned again and again, changing form but never vanishing. This vision was beautiful, but to the Vatican it was heresy of the highest order. The Church claimed that revelation happened once, that Christ entered history once, that salvation was offered once, that judgment would come once. This linear path gave the Church unparalleled power, for it meant that without their guidance, a soul could miss its only chance at eternity. But the Mayan view shattered this structure. If revelation could return in endless cycles, then no gate stood forever. No institution could lock truth behind walls or claim exclusive ownership of salvation. The eternal return mocked the idea of one true church and one final judgment. Imagine a villager in 16th century Europe told that history was not a straight line from Genesis to the Apocalypse, but a wheel turning endlessly. The terror of hell would lose its grip, because another chance would always come. The authority of priests would crumble, because revelation would not be confined to scripture, but could emerge again in another age, in another form, under another sky. This is why the doctrine of eternal return was not just different, it was dangerous. It suggested that truth was free, that it could never be contained by any one faith, and that even empires like Rome were only temporary expressions within a cycle. Missionaries who encountered the Mayan calendar quickly understood the threat. They labeled the cycles superstition and condemned them as satanic illusions. Yet, in secret, some could not help but marvel at the accuracy of the astronomical calculations tied to these cycles. The Maya predicted eclipses, solstices, and planetary alignments with stunning precision. If their cycles could predict the heavens so well, then perhaps their philosophy of time might also hold weight, and that possibility was unacceptable to a church built upon the authority of a single, unrepeatable revelation. For centuries, the Vatican worked tirelessly to erase or reinterpret any trace of cyclical thinking. They burned codices, suppressed indigenous accounts, and reshaped the narrative so that the Maya appeared as ignorant pagans. But beneath the ashes, the truth persisted. The stones of abandoned temples still whispered of ages before our age, of worlds that ended and began anew. And each whisper carried the same message: nothing is final, everything returns. This idea frightened the guardians of linear time because it stripped them of their greatest weapon: fear of missing out on salvation. If truth comes again, then no gatekeeper can hold it hostage. The eternal return means that power itself is cyclical. Thrones rise, popes fall, empires collapse, and knowledge once hidden emerges again in the light. For the Maya, this was not heresy. It was simply the way the universe breathes. But for the Vatican, it was a nightmare, because if truth returns again and again, then no gate stands forever. In the carved glyphs of the Maya lies a secret that startled even the most learned Europeans when they first glimpsed it. A number system unlike anything Rome had carried across the seas. Instead of counting in tens as Europe did, the Maya built their mathematics on 20s. Fingers and toes together gave the measure of the cosmos. With this system, they stacked numbers high enough to track not only years, but ages, backtunes that stretched across centuries. Yet it was not the base of 20 that shook the foundations of theology. It was the symbol they gave to nothing. The Maya treated zero not as absence but as presence. A shell glyph, delicate yet powerful, represented the void. To them, it was not a mistake or a gap in the order of things. It was the sacred resting place between cycles, the underworld where endings transformed into beginnings. Zero was alive. It held meaning, function, and reverence. This idea was centuries ahead of Europe, where zero had long been mistrusted. Even as Arabic numerals spread across the continent, many theologians resisted the symbol of nothingness. To them, it carried dangerous echoes. How could a void be given value when creation itself was said to come from God's word, not from emptiness? In medieval thought, the universe was full of angels, stars, spheres, and divine purpose. Nothingness was tied to fear, to hell, to the absence of God. To embrace zero, as the Maya did, was to embrace the void as sacred, a step that threatened Christian doctrine. If nothingness could be counted, then perhaps it was not evil, but necessary. And if cycles passed through zero, then perhaps even death was not an end, but a continuation. For the Church, this blurred too many lines. It weakened the sharp finality of sin and judgment. The Maya used zero with elegance. Their long count calendar could not have existed without it. They placed it in their inscriptions as confidently as they placed the sun and the moon. It allowed them to calculate dates thousands of years into the past and future, weaving humanity into the fabric of cosmic time. When Europeans first encountered these calculations, some dismissed them as coincidence. Others, in secret, recognized that the Maya had grasped a truth Europe had only recently begun to explore through contact with Arabic mathematics. Yet the context here was different. Zero in Europe was a tool. Zero in the Maya world was a bridge between life, death, and renewal. This was more than numbers. It was philosophy carved into arithmetic, and it terrified those who clung to linear salvation. If nothingness could be sacred, then the Church no longer owned the boundary between creation and destruction. A void could hold life, and endings could hold beginnings without the need for priests to unlock the gate. That was a power no institution could tolerate. So the mathematics of the underworld was brushed aside as pagan trickery, even as fragments of Mayan calculation slipped quietly into European hands. But the truth could not be erased. The shell glyph still stares back from ancient stone, reminding us that sometimes the greatest fear of power is not chaos or sin, but the sacred value of nothing at all. On the temple steps of Yucatán, the world once trembled under a battle of symbols. For centuries, the Maya had raised their eyes to the heavens and honored Kukulkan, the feathered serpent who moved between worlds of sky and earth. His image wound down the staircases of pyramids during the equinox, sunlight shaping his coils in shadow as if the cosmos itself bowed to his return. He was not only a god, but also a sign of cycles, renewal, and balance. Then came the wooden cross, carried by friars who planted it into the same soil, declaring that one symbol must erase the other. To the missionaries, the serpent was evil, a creature tied in their minds to the snake in Eden and the fall of mankind. To the Maya, he was a giver of knowledge and order. When the two worldviews collided, the serpent and the cross became more than carvings. They became opposing truths. Which one represented the sky? Which one held the keys to the future? The struggle did not stay in words. It played out in rituals, in forced conversions, in the tearing down of serpent idols, and the raising of crucifixes in their place. But the heavens themselves seemed to join the conflict. Chroniclers describe a great comet blazing across the night sky in the early years of conquest. To Europeans, it was an omen, often of disaster or divine judgment. To the Maya, it was a flare in the cycle, a signal that change was unfolding. The comet, bright and untamed, became a third symbol in the war of meanings. It seemed to declare that no matter what humans carved or carried, the sky would still write its own signs. And those signs could not be silenced. Imagine the fear of a missionary watching converts kneel at the cross by day, yet still glance toward the serpent shadow at night. Imagine the unease of a Maya elder watching his grandchildren make the sign of the cross, while remembering whispered stories of Kukulkan. In that tension, symbols became weapons sharper than swords. The serpent promised cycles, the cross promised final judgment, and the comet reminded both that the cosmos had its own language beyond human control. The Vatican feared this war of signs because it exposed a vulnerability. What if the serpent and the cross were not opposites at all, but parallel attempts to describe the same truth? What if the comet's fire showed that knowledge lay in the sky, not in the church's vaults? Admitting this would shatter the monopoly on meaning. So the serpent was branded demonic, the comet ignored or reinterpreted, and the cross made the only permitted sign. Yet the stones of Chichen Itzá still carry the shadow of the feathered serpent. The stories of the comet still echo in oral memory. And the cross, though dominant, has never erased them fully. On those temple steps, a silent battle continues, a battle of symbols, each one pointing upward, each one claiming the heavens, and each one reminding us that truth is never carried by only a single sign. There was once a friar who did not only burn the books of the Maya, but also tried to understand them. He listened to elders, copied their words, and compared their glyphs with Spanish letters. Out of this strange partnership, a manuscript was born, a bilingual codex that recorded not just rituals and prayers, but also prophecies and star omens. It was a bridge between two worlds, half in Latin letters, half in the language of the jungle. For a moment, it seemed as if two histories might speak to each other. Then the manuscript vanished. The friar's work was real enough to be cited by other missionaries. They described how he had written down accounts of eclipses, predictions of upheavals, and signs in the heavens that aligned with Mayan cycles. Some even admitted that the prophecies matched unsettlingly well with events unfolding in their own time: plagues, wars, strange celestial flares. The codex did not simply repeat myth. It read like a map of time that continued to unfold even as it was being written. Such a document was too dangerous to ignore, but far more dangerous to spread. Soon, references to it grew quiet. The manuscript, once discussed in letters, slipped into silence. Scholars later searched archives and found no trace of the original. It was as if it had been erased with the same precision it was once compiled. Some whispered that the Vatican had taken it into the secret archive, buried beneath stone so that its prophecies would never trouble faith. Others suspected it had been destroyed outright, burned not because it was false, but because it was too true. In either case, its disappearance left behind a ghost. Imagine what that codex contained. Pages where Mayan glyphs charted Venus cycles alongside Spanish notes. Predictions of droughts and comets next to Latin prayers. A dialogue not of conquest but of recognition. Such a book could have changed how history saw the Maya, not as pagans lost in superstition, but as keepers of a cosmic science. Yet the world never saw it. And in that silence, one truth becomes clear. The most threatening book is not the one that screams heresy. It is the one that whispers agreement with the stars. The loss of the Friars' Codex is not unique. Many manuscripts from the 16th century surface in citations, only to disappear later. Some survive in fragments, some are rumoured to lie in private collections, some simply vanish with no explanation. But this one stings more sharply because it represented an uneasy fusion of two knowledge systems. It could have forced Europe to acknowledge that the Maya had a valid, even superior grasp of cosmic cycles. Instead, it was removed, and history continued on a path where the Church remained the sole keeper of time. What remains now are echoes, lines quoted in other writings, hints that the manuscript once lived. Its absence is itself a kind of presence, a hole shaped like knowledge denied. And perhaps that is the greatest omen of all. A prophecy fulfilled not in stars or comets, but in silence. Because sometimes the most powerful chronicles are the ones we are never allowed to read. In a dim library, lit only by the flicker of a candle, a bishop once bent over a manuscript, his quill scratching quietly in the margins. The book itself was a theological commentary, safe, orthodox, meant to guide young priests. But in the narrow gutter between printed lines, the bishop wrote something different, something he was not supposed to say out loud. He confessed that the Maya knew the sky better than Europe. Just 7 words, but they carried the weight of a shaken world. He had seen their tables of Venus, their eclipse glyphs, their calendars stretching across centuries, and he could not deny their brilliance. Yet he dared not say it in the body of the text, only in the margins where whispers hide. For years the note sat unnoticed, a quiet mark of honesty left by a man torn between faith and truth. Then another hand found it. A later owner of the book, perhaps another churchman, perhaps a cautious librarian, saw the confession and scraped it thin. The words were not completely erased, but nearly so. The ink rubbed until it faded into the parchment. Only faint shadows of the letters remained, a ghost of the thought. It was not destroyed outright, but silenced, reduced to something only the most careful eye might ever rediscover. Why scrape and not burn? Because the book itself was valuable, part of a collection too important to destroy. The confession was the problem, not the commentary. And so it was handled with precision, like surgery. The dangerous words were removed, while the rest of the book remained intact. In this way, the Church preserved the appearance of orthodoxy while quietly burying the one crack in its surface. Imagine the fear behind those faint letters. A bishop, a man sworn to defend the authority of Rome, admitting in private that indigenous priests in the jungles of Yucatán could read the heavens with more accuracy than Christendom. Such an admission shook the very structure of salvation history. If the Maya could know the sky without scripture, then perhaps they could also know truths about time, creation, and destiny without the Church. And if that were true, then the monopoly on heaven's knowledge was broken. Centuries later, scholars stumbled across the nearly vanished line in an archive, barely legible under magnification. The words became a puzzle, reconstructed through careful study. The fact that someone had tried so hard to scrape them away only made them more haunting. It showed that fear lingered even in the margins, fear that a single sentence could unravel the authority of an entire institution. The bishop's confession reminds us that truth does not always roar in proclamations. Sometimes it hides in whispers, in the thin spaces of a page, in ink that survives just enough to be read again. His 7 words may never have changed his world, but they survived long enough to trouble ours. And, in their survival, lies a deeper truth. Power can scrape, silence, and suppress, but even the faintest shadow of a confession can outlast the hands that tried to erase it. In every civilization, there are those who trade not in gold or grain, but in time itself. Among the Maya, the keepers of the calendar held this power. They were not only priests of the sky, but also merchants of destiny. They decided when rituals would be held, when fields should be planted, when kings should wage war, and when peace must be kept. To set a date was to set the rhythm of society. Whoever named the day shaped the lives of thousands. In Europe, the same role was claimed by the Church. Feast days, holy days, saints' days, all carefully arranged to guide the crowds. Whoever controlled the calendar controlled the people. For the Maya, this control was woven into baktuns, vast spans of nearly 400 years that framed entire eras. When a baktun ended and another began, rulers declared it with ceremonies that shook kingdoms. They inscribed the new age on stone, linking themselves to cosmic renewal. In these moments, power shifted. A king who claimed to rule at the turning of a baktun was no ordinary man. He was chosen by the cycle itself. His authority was not only political but cosmic. The people followed because the stars and the calendar declared it so. The Spanish quickly understood this dangerous parallel. The Church also tied power to time. The Pope declared Easter. The Pope named Jubilees. Every holy day set by Rome brought the faithful into line, filling churches, directing labour, and shaping the year around liturgical rhythm. To admit that another civilization had mastered the same system was to admit that time itself could be negotiated outside the Church. This threatened the Vatican's greatest tool, not the sword, not even the Bible, but the calendar. Reports from missionaries describe their frustration when indigenous communities insisted on celebrating rituals according to their own count. Even after conversion, many Maya kept parallel calendars, one public and one hidden. On the surface, they honoured the saints on Roman feast days. In secret, they still tracked the cycles of Venus and the counts of the moon. To the friars, this was heresy. To the Maya, it was balance. They had learned to live in 2 calendars at once, never letting go of the merchants of time who had guided them for centuries. Imagine the fear in Rome if it were revealed that the Maya calendar not only rivaled, but often surpassed the Church's system in precision. Imagine the scandal if peasants in Europe learned that far across the ocean, another priesthood had long managed the flow of time without the papacy. Authority would crumble. Faith would falter. So the strategy was simple. Brand Mayan cycles as superstition, destroy their books, and replace their feast days with saints' days. Over generations, the substitution would erase memory itself. Yet traces remain. Hidden calendars, whispered dates, ceremonies that survived in disguise. They remind us that power is not only about armies or crowns, it is about clocks and calendars. Whoever sets the feast day owns the crowd. Whoever names the baktun owns the age. And in that truth, we glimpse why the Vatican feared the merchants of time more than any army the jungle could ever raise. In Europe, the calendar was not only a way to mark days, it was a weapon. As the year 1000 approached, panic spread through villages and kingdoms. Preachers warned of the end of the world, of Christ's return, of fire that would cleanse the earth. When the dreaded date passed without apocalypse, the fear did not vanish. It was reshaped, rolled forward into new countdowns tied to comets, eclipses, and papal decrees. Fear became a policy tool. Armies were rallied with cries of prophecy. Crusades were launched with promises that the end was near and salvation could be earned through holy war. The Church learned that to control expectation was to control action. Across the ocean, the Maya had long used their own countdowns. They tracked the ends of backtons with precision, preparing for the close of one age and the opening of another. These were not random anxieties, but carefully measured cycles. When the long count marked a great ending, ceremonies filled plazas, kings performed bloodletting, and people braced for renewal. The fear of an ending was balanced by the hope of a beginning, yet the power it gave to rulers was undeniable. They could declare themselves chosen by the cycle, destined to lead their people into the new age. When European missionaries encountered this way of thinking, they recognized something familiar and terrifying. The Maya had their own version of millenarian countdowns, but instead of one final apocalypse, they repeated endlessly. For Rome, this was intolerable. If people believed the world would end only once, the Church could forever hold the keys to salvation. But if people believed that worlds end and return again, the fear lost its edge. Power built on a single judgment crumbles when faced with infinite renewals. Still, the two systems of countdowns met in strange ways. Reports from the 16th century tell of friars using Mayan cycles to time their preaching, warning converts that their gods had predicted destruction and only Christ could save them. In this way, they twisted Mayan prophecy into a tool for their own crusade. Meanwhile, Maya priests, pressured to abandon their traditions, sometimes disguised their cycle counts under the cloak of Christian festivals. To the outside eye, they honored a saint's day. In secret, they marked the turning of their calendar, waiting for a cycle their oppressors could not erase. Fear became the common currency. In Europe, it was the fear of the final trumpet. In the Americas, it was the fear of cycles closing with famine, drought, or war. Leaders on both continents discovered that when people believed time itself was running out, they could be made to obey, to fight, even to die. The Vatican feared Mayan cycles, not because they were strange, but because they were familiar. Both systems showed how time could be turned into a lever of control. But one system allowed only one ending, forever locking humanity under the watch of Rome. The other promised endless returns, slipping through the fingers of any gatekeeper. And in that difference lay the reason why countdowns in Europe led to crusades, while countdowns in Mesoamerica promised that even conquest was not the final word. The plaza was filled with people, their eyes fixed on the friar who raised a wooden cross high above his head. He declared that a miracle would take place, that God would prove his power to the converts gathered under the blazing Sunday. The sermon was fiery, the crowd restless, and the air heavy with expectation. Yet above them, the heavens prepared a spectacle the friar had not planned. Because carved into stone centuries before, hidden in codices spared from the flames, the Maya had already marked this very day. They knew the sun would vanish. They knew an eclipse was coming. When the shadow began to creep across the disk of the sun, whispers spread faster than the sermon. Eyes turned upward. Faces darkened with awe and fear. The friar tried to claim it was the miracle he had promised, but the people knew better. Their ancestors had written it into calendars, their sky priests had calculated it with precision, and their memory had carried it forward. The eclipse was not proof of a foreign god, it was proof of their own. The moment was devastating for the mission. What was meant to be a display of divine triumph turned into a revelation of Mayan accuracy. The friar's words were drowned out by the silence of the crowd staring skyward. In that silence lay a quiet rebellion. The people did not rush to kneel at the cross. They did not cheer the miracle. They simply watched the sky do exactly what their own tradition had always said it would do. For the Vatican, this kind of event was a nightmare. Miracles were supposed to confirm the authority of the Church, not expose its fragility. The Mayan calendar had predicted darkness at the very moment the friar claimed light. The authority of the pulpit cracked in an instant. No doctrine, no sermon, no ritual could compete with the raw certainty of the heavens. You could burn books and smash idols, but you could not erase the movement of the moon. Mission reports that survived from those years often gloss over such incidents, or twist them into tales of mass conversions. But scattered native accounts, and even a few candid notes from priests, tell a different story. They speak of hesitation, of doubts that spread, of whole villages who turned away after witnessing an eclipse exactly as foretold by their ancestors. The friars learned to fear the sky, to avoid promising miracles on days when celestial events might betray them. This was the power the Maya had guarded for centuries. Not armies, not steel, but the ability to read the rhythm of the heavens with precision. In a world where the church built its power on controlling memory and prophecy, the sky itself became the great rival. And no vault, no sermon, no index of forbidden books could hide an eclipse. The day the sun vanished was not remembered as a miracle of the cross. It was remembered as the day the sky chose the Maya over Rome. A silence more powerful than any sermon, a darkness that revealed a truth the Vatican could never fully suppress. Deep in the jungle, explorers stumbled upon a map unlike anything they had seen before. It was not drawn on parchment with tidy compass roses or neatly measured distances. It was carved into stone, its lines marked not by north or south, but by the rising and setting of the Sunday. The map oriented itself to solstices and equinoxes, the great turning points of light. To follow it, one did not need a magnet or a compass. One needed only the heavens. For European empires, whose ships rode steel and whose borders depended on charts with north at the top, this was deeply unsettling. The Mayan map reflected a worldview that was not anchored to poles or invisible lines of latitude. Instead, it was tied to cycles of light and shadow. A traveller guided by such a chart would not ask which direction was north, but rather when the sun would rise at its farthest point, when the shadow of a temple would fall longest, when the heavens marked the balance of day and night. Navigation was not about conquering distance, it was about flowing with the rhythm of time. To empires hungry for conquest, this way of mapping was almost incomprehensible. Imagine a conquistador trying to use such a map. He turns it this way and that, searching for the familiar arrow pointing north. It is not there. Instead, he finds glyphs of suns, moons, and serpents, lines pointing toward the horizon, not toward any magnetic pole. To him it looks like superstition, perhaps even nonsense. But to the Maya, it was far more precise than any compass. The solstices never fail. The sun will always rise at the same point on the horizon in June and December. The map, with no north, could guide a traveller with certainty that no iron needle could match. For the Vatican, this approach to mapping was more than confusing, it was threatening. Maps in Europe were tied to theology as much as to geography. Jerusalem often sat at the centre. Christendom spread outward like the spokes of a wheel. North was crowned as the guiding point, a symbol of order. But a map aligned to light suggested another order entirely, one that did not need the cross at its centre or the Pope's decree to define its edges. It was a map that placed humanity within cycles of the cosmos rather than above them. Such maps rarely survived intact. Many were dismissed as primitive art and left to decay. Others were confiscated and locked away. But whispers of them remained, stories of jungle charts that could predict when rivers would flood or when trade routes would open by the light of the stars. For an empire of steel and gunpowder, this was knowledge too strange to embrace and too dangerous to allow free. The map with no north stands as a reminder that not all journeys are measured in miles, and not all directions are dictated by compasses. Some are measured in the turning of the sky, in the longest day and the longest night. And perhaps that was the very reason the Vatican feared it, because a map that guides by light instead of magnet does not lead back to Rome, it leads to the heavens, and no empire can redraw those lines. In the years after conquest, when swords and crosses ruled the plazas and the old temples lay in ruins, hope did not vanish completely. It retreated into whispers. Families gathered in the dark corners of huts, elders traced lines in the dirt, and fragments of the Mayan calendar were read in secret. The friars had tried to erase it, but memory has a way of surviving. And in those whispered readings, people began to see not just cycles of time, but promises of renewal. Prophecy became rebellion, not with weapons, but with hope. The Maya believed that no age lasted forever. Every backtune, every cycle, would eventually close, sweeping away kings and empires alike. Even the mightiest rulers could not escape the turning of the calendar. For those living under Spanish rule, this truth became a quiet form of resistance. If Rome claimed to rule forever, the calendar reminded them that forever does not exist. A new age was always coming. An age that would end the cycle of suffering. An age that might restore what had been lost. Reports from colonial officials speak nervously of uprisings, sparked not by armies, but by prophets. Men and women declared that the calendar had foretold the fall of the invaders. They gathered followers, promising that the cycle was about to turn. These movements were crushed, often violently, but they revealed something frightening to the authorities. The Mayan calendar had become more than numbers. It was a seed of rebellion. To believe in its cycles was to believe that no foreign rule was permanent. The Vatican understood this danger well. A prophecy that promised renewal undermined the doctrine of one final judgment. The Church taught people to wait for salvation at the end of time. But the calendar offered salvation again and again, in every turning of the wheel. That difference bred defiance. You did not have to wait for heaven. You could hope for change in this world, in your own lifetime, perhaps even in the next backtune. That kind of hope was explosive. Friars tried to stamp it out. They labelled prophets as heretics, punished those who gathered in secret, and declared the old calendar demonic. Yet the cycle persisted in memory, hidden in the rhythm of planting and harvest, in the timing of rituals disguised as Christian festivals. Every solstice and equinox became a reminder that the world still turned on the old rhythm, no matter what Rome declared. The greatest rebellions often begin not with swords, but with belief. In the Maya highlands, prophecies spread like sparks. They did not always ignite into full uprisings, but they kept alive a forbidden fire, a reminder that empires fall and ages renew. For the Spanish crown and the Vatican, this was the most dangerous truth of all. You can conquer land, you can burn books, but you cannot stop a people from believing that tomorrow belongs to a new cycle. And sometimes, belief itself is the sharpest blade of rebellion. In a quiet study, far from the jungles of Yucatán, a Jesuit priest bent over a set of strange papers. They were not written in Latin or Greek, but in glyphs copied from Mayan codices. Alongside them were European tables of planetary movement, the best astronomy Rome had to offer. The priest, trained in mathematics and devoted to the heavens, compared the numbers carefully. Again and again he found the same unsettling truth. The Mayan Venus tables were not only accurate, they surpassed Europe's. Predictions that in Europe carried small errors were recorded in the Mayan system with near perfection. The discovery left him with a choice that weighed heavier than any telescope or parchment. Publish the truth and challenge the authority of the Church, or bury it to preserve order. For the Jesuits, knowledge was a double-edged sword. They were the intellectual arm of the Church, dedicated to study, to teaching, to science itself. But they were also sworn to defend faith and protect doctrine. The astronomer knew what his discovery meant. If word spread that a so-called pagan people had mapped Venus with more precision than Christendom, the Vatican's authority would falter. The heavens were supposed to declare the glory of God as revealed through the Church. Yet here was proof that the heavens spoke fluently in another language one Rome had tried to erase. The priest wrote private notes, cautious and coded. He marveled at the Mayan system, at its base of 20 mathematics, at its embrace of cycles and zero. He even admitted to himself that their philosophy of time seemed to grant them an edge, a way to track planets across ages instead of decades. But every time he considered making these notes public, he paused. To reveal them would be to betray his vows. Worse, it might brand him a heretic, guilty of lifting pagan wisdom above the wisdom of Rome. Imagine the tension in his heart. On one hand, the thrill of discovery, the joy of knowing he had glimpsed a truth hidden beneath centuries of ash and silence. On the other hand, the fear that such truth would shatter the fragile order of faith. The Jesuit astronomer stood at a crossroads: publish truth or preserve order. In the end, like so many before him, he chose silence. His notes were locked away, hidden in archives, occasionally whispered among a circle of trusted scholars, but never shouted to the world. And so, the Venus tables remained in the shadows. Europe continued to celebrate its own breakthroughs. Galileo turning his telescope in 1609, Kepler calculating orbits, Newton framing the laws of motion. All the while, the Mayan tables, centuries older, waited in secret. The Jesuits' dilemma became the world's loss. Because in his silence, humanity was denied the recognition that science can rise anywhere, that truth belongs not to one empire, but to all who dare to look up. His decision echoes still. Every time we marvel at the precision of Mayan astronomy, we are also reminded of the man who confirmed it but chose not to speak. He chose order over truth, Rome over the stars. And in that choice lies the weight of history, a silence as heavy as stone. In the final years before the year 2012, the world found itself obsessed with a date carved in stone centuries earlier. Television specials, books, and endless internet forums proclaimed that the Mayan calendar predicted the end of the world. The countdown spread across continents, fueled by fear and fascination. For the first time since the conquest, the ancient cycles of the Maya were not whispered in secret or hidden in archives. They were broadcast globally, and, with every passing day toward December 21st, anxiety grew. What had once terrified missionaries now unsettled modern society. People asked if the world would end in fire, flood, or cosmic disaster. Astronomers were dragged into debates, explaining again and again that no planet would collide with Earth, no rogue star was approaching, and the sky held no apocalypse. Yet, the fear persisted because it was never about astronomy alone. It was about the echo of an old fear, the memory of cycles that Rome had tried to erase. The Vatican downplayed the frenzy. Priests gave interviews, reminding the faithful that the end of time belonged only to God, not to ancient calendars. They called the panic superstition, much as their predecessors had called the original codices pagan lies. But the very need to respond revealed something deeper. The Church recognized that the Mayan vision of time still had power, even after centuries of suppression. People around the world were willing to believe in cycles of renewal rather than a single final judgment, and that belief made the guardians of linear time uneasy. Meanwhile, the internet amplified every rumor. Stories of planetary alignments, black holes, and hidden prophecies spread like wildfire. A single stone carving of the long count was shared across millions of screens. For some, 2012 became a symbol of doom. For others, it was a symbol of hope, a chance for spiritual awakening, for the turning of an age. In that global conversation, the Mayan calendar came alive again, not as an artifact in a museum, but as a living story. When December 21st arrived, the world did not end. The sun rose, the sky remained, and life continued. Critics mocked the panic, but the truth is more subtle. The Mayan calendar had never predicted an apocalypse. It had marked the end of a Bakhtun, a cycle of nearly 400 years, and the beginning of another, renewal, not destruction. That message had been twisted for centuries, first by conquistadors, then by modern media. Yet beneath the noise, the original wisdom remained. The year 2012 was not the end. It was the echo of a fear once born in Rome, when missionaries realized the Maya believed in cycles, not finalities. That fear traveled across oceans, burned in bonfires, hid in archives, and resurfaced in the digital age. And perhaps that is the greatest irony. The prophecy that the Vatican once tried to silence was not destroyed. It returned, as all cycles do, proving the Maya right once more. Nothing ends forever. Everything returns, even fear. The few Mayan codices that survived the flames are fragile. Their bark pages cracked and faded, but their message is clear. They do not describe a single final day when the world will vanish into nothing. They speak instead of thresholds, endings that are not collapses but crossings, closures followed by openings. Every cycle in the long count leads not to destruction but to renewal. The world does not die forever. It transforms. For the Maya, this was not doom but destiny, a truth as steady as the rising of the Sunday. Yet, this simple truth has always terrified those who built their power on finality. The Vatican thrived on the story that time was a straight line, creation, sin, and judgment. One path, one ending, one gatekeeper. That story gave the Church control because it meant humanity had only one chance. Salvation was singular and exclusive, but the codices told another tale. They revealed that time is generous, that it gives countless chances, that every end is only another beginning. If people believed this, fear would lose its power, and if fear vanished, the hold of the Church would weaken. The codices describe astronomical cycles with breathtaking accuracy. Venus, the moon, eclipses, solstices. They chart the patterns of the sky, not to terrify, but to prepare. They warn of times when balance would shift, when kingdoms might fall, when drought or flood would return. But always, woven into these warnings, is the assurance that after darkness comes light, after collapse comes renewal. It is a philosophy of resilience, not despair. And that resilience is exactly what conquerors and missionaries tried to stamp out. For centuries, misinterpretations painted the Maya as obsessed with apocalypse. In the modern world, the year 2012 became the climax of that misunderstanding. But the codices themselves never claimed the end of existence. They spoke of the close of a Bacton, a chapter in time, and the start of a new one. To the Maya, this was cause for ceremony and reverence, not panic. It was a time to honor the cycle, to prepare for change, and to embrace renewal. The Church could never allow such an idea to stand. A people who believe in eternal renewal are hard to control. They do not fear one last judgment. They do not bend to the threat of eternal exile. They endure, confident that even in loss the cycle will return. That confidence fuels rebellion, hope, and defiance. It makes authority fragile, so the codices were branded heretical, their wisdom burned, their meaning twisted. What remained was silence, or worse, distortion. Today, when we study the codices, when we look past the scars of fire and the stains of time, we see not doom, but continuity. We see a people who believed the universe was alive with rhythm. And we see why the Vatican feared them. Because renewal terrifies those whose power rests on finality. The Maya knew that no gate can remain shut forever. Time itself will open it again. And in that opening lies both freedom and truth. If time is a wheel, then forgetting is the brake that keeps it from moving. For centuries, the Mayan cycles were hidden, burned, or twisted into false prophecies of doom. The Church called them superstition. Scholars dismissed them as primitive. Pop culture turned them into a cheap scare about the end of the world in 2012. But what if forgetting them was never an accident? What if the silence around them was carefully maintained, because remembering would mean waking up to a different way of seeing history, a way that doesn't depend on fear? The Mayan vision of time did not belong to kings, popes, or priests. It belonged to the stars, to the people who watched them, and to the generations who lived beneath their patterns. That vision said no ending was ever final, no collapse permanent. Even destruction was only part of the cycle. That kind of knowledge could empower peasants, rebels, and dreamers. It gave hope where fear once ruled. It told the farmer who lost his crops that rains would return. It told the child born in a war that peace would come again. And it told the captive under the shadow of the cross that the empire above him was not eternal. So who benefits when cycles are hidden? The answer is simple. Those who claim to be the only path to salvation. Those who say there is no second chance. Those who demand obedience by teaching that time itself is running out. A straight line with one final judgment keeps power centralized. A wheel with endless revolutions breaks that power apart. Because if everything returns, then no institution can lock truth away forever. No throne, no crown, no papal key can hold eternity still. But something changes when forgotten cycles are read again. The wheel begins to move. People start to see history differently. They realize the so-called Dark Ages were not total darkness, only another turn of the cycle. They recognize that collapse is not the end of progress, but a pause before renewal. And they begin to question the stories that kept them afraid. Fear fades, and curiosity grows. Authority loses its grip, and imagination takes its place. The age that begins when we remember is not about repeating the past exactly as it was. It is about restoring balance to the story of humanity. It is about knowing that loss and renewal are part of the same truth, that forgetting makes us weak, and remembering makes us free. The Maya never promised safety. What they offered was something greater, a map of time itself, showing us that no gate stays closed forever, no darkness lasts without end. The final question is not whether their prophecies were right or wrong. It is whether we are ready to remember them, because the wheel has always been turning, with or without our consent. And the moment we awaken to it, a new age begins, not in fear, but in freedom.